For centuries, it dominated the known world. Its banners were feared. Its armies were unstoppable. Its cities glowed with wealth, learning, and power. Neighboring kingdoms measured their own survival by how far they stood from its borders. And then, almost without warning, it was gone. No grand final battle, remembered in legend. No heroic last stand preserved in epic songs. Just silence, empty streets, broken walls, ash beneath the soil. Historians would later struggle to explain how a civilization so vast, so sophisticated, and so powerful could vanish so quickly that it felt as if history itself blinked and missed it. This is not the story of slow decline. This is not the tale of an empire that withered over centuries. This is a story of an ancient superpower that disappeared so suddenly that even its enemies were left confused, standing among ruins they did not fully understand. A civilization that ruled trade routes, commanded armies, shaped culture, and bent neighboring nations to its will, only to collapse in what seemed like a single moment in time. To understand how something so immense could vanish overnight, we must first understand how absolute its power once was. At its height, this superpower stretched across vast lands. Mountains, rivers, deserts, and seas all fell within its reach. Roads cut through hostile terrain with astonishing precision, allowing armies to move faster than anyone thought possible. Fortified cities rose from stone and mud brick, protected by walls so thick they were believed to be eternal. Inside them, artisans crafted luxury goods that traveled thousands of miles. Merchants spoke dozens of languages. Priests interpreted the will of gods whose names echoed through temples lit by fire and incense. This was a civilization that understood organization, bureaucracy, logistics, engineering. It controlled food production with granaries large enough to feed entire regions during famine. Its scribes recorded taxes, treaties, and laws on tablets, papyrus, or carved stone. Knowledge was power, and this empire hoarded it carefully. Its rulers were not merely kings. They were chosen by gods, or claimed to be. Their authority was reinforced by ritual, architecture, and fear. Palaces towered above cities as physical reminders that power was permanent, divinely protected, and unchallengeable. To rebel was not just treason, it was sacrilege. And yet, beneath this image of invincibility, cracks were forming, like many great empires. The superpower was stretched thin. The very size that made it dominant also made it vulnerable. Borders grew longer. Armies were divided. Governors ruled distant provinces with increasing independence. Messages that once took days now took weeks. Decisions made at the center arrived too late at the edges. Still, none of this suggested sudden annihilation. Empires weakened before. They adapted. They survived. No one expected what came next, because the collapse did not arrive with a warning trumpet. It arrived quietly, and then all at once. Archaeological evidence tells a chilling story. Entire cities were destroyed within a narrow window of time. Layers of ash appear simultaneously across regions hundreds of miles apart. Fortifications show signs of desperate defense, but also of being abandoned mid-use. Storage rooms remain full, food left untouched, tools dropped where people last stood. It is as if life simply stopped. There are no orderly evacuations, no gradual decline in craftsmanship, no long transition to a weaker culture. Instead, there's absence. For decades, historians believe invasion must be the answer, some unknown enemy, a coalition of rivals, a barbarian horde sweeping through the land. But the evidence does not fit a single conquering force. The destruction is too widespread, too synchronized. Different regions show different methods of collapse. Fire in one place, abandonment in another, earthquake damage elsewhere. This was not one cause. It was a perfect storm. Climate records reveal that around the time of the collapse, the world itself turned hostile. Years of drought followed by sudden flooding disrupted agriculture. Crops failed. Rivers changed course. Trade routes became unreliable. A system built on surplus and stability suddenly faced scarcity and chaos. At the same time, internal tensions grew. When food becomes scarce, loyalty fades. Soldiers go unpaid. Officials hoard resources. Provinces begin to act independently. Trust between ruler and ruled erodes. And then came disease. Mass graves appear in some cities. Skeletons show signs of malnutrition and illness. Crowded urban centers, once symbols of prosperity, became breeding grounds for epidemics. People fled cities, carrying sickness with them. Labor shortages crippled infrastructure. Fields went unplanted. Roads fell into disrepair. Still, the empire might have survived this. Others had, but fate was not finished. Seismic evidence suggests a series of powerful earthquakes struck key regions. Walls collapsed, palaces cracked, temples fell. For a society that believed its gods protected its rulers, this was more than physical destruction. It was spiritual catastrophe. If the gods could abandon them, then everything they believed was a lie. Rebellions erupted. Former subject peoples seized a moment. Mercenaries turned against their employers. Border enemies pressed inward, not as a single army, but as waves of opportunistic attacks. The central authority tried to respond, but it was too late. Communication had broken down. Armies could not be assembled in time. Supply lines failed. Commanders acted on outdated orders. The empire no longer moved as one body, but as disconnected limbs. And then, suddenly, the records stop, writing disappears. Official seals vanish. Coin production ceases. Monument construction ends abruptly. The lights go out, not gradually, but everywhere at once. Within a generation, the empire that once ruled the world existed only in memory. Later civilizations would build atop its ruins, unaware of the full scale of what came before. Stones from its temples were reused in new buildings. Roads were traveled without knowing who first laid them. Stories survived only as distorted legends, tales of giants, gods, or cursed kings. For centuries, scholars debated whether the superpower ever truly existed. The silence it left behind was so complete that some believed it had been exaggerated, mythologized, or invented entirely. Only archaeology would slowly reveal the truth. Beneath layers of soil, the remains of a lost world emerged. Burned cities, collapsed walls, abandoned workshops, evidence of sudden, violent interruption. A civilization frozen at the exact moment of its destruction. And with each discovery, the same question returned. How could something so powerful vanish overnight? The answer is uncomfortable, because it reminds us that no matter how advanced, no matter how organized, no matter how confident a civilization becomes, it is never invincible. Power depends on balance, on climate, on health, on trust, on belief. Remove enough of those at once, and even the greatest superpower can fall faster than anyone imagines, not with a single blow, but with silence. And somewhere beneath the earth, its ruins still wait, whispering a warning to every civilization that believes it will last forever. The ruins do not scream their story. They whisper it. When archaeologists first uncovered the remnants of this vanished superpower, they were struck not only by what was found, but by what was missing. There were no final inscriptions boasting of heroic resistance, no victory monuments erected by conquerors, no chronicles describing a glorious last stand. Instead, there was abandonment, homes left with furniture still inside, workshops with half-finished tools, temples where offerings lay undisturbed, as if the priests never returned from a single ordinary day. This kind of silence is rare in history. Usually, when an empire falls, something replaces it. A new power rises in its place, adopting its systems, its language, its identity. But here, the collapse created a vacuum so profound that entire regions slipped backward. Writing vanished. Trade networks disintegrated. Craftsmanship declined. Populations shrank. The world became smaller, poorer, and more fragmented. For generations, people lived among the ruins without understanding them. They walked past enormous stone blocks they could no longer lift. They reused fragments of walls whose original purpose they could not imagine. They told stories of ancestors who were said to have spoken with gods, commanded thunder, or ruled the earth when giants still walked among humans. In a way, they were not entirely wrong. This ancient superpower had mastered technologies that later societies struggled to replicate. Precision masonry without modern tools. Long-distance administration without fast communication. Agricultural systems finely tuned to fragile environments. These were not primitive people stumbling toward civilization. They were experts standing at the peak of their world. And that makes their disappearance even more disturbing, because it was not ignorance that destroyed them. It was complexity. The empire's strength depended on everything working at once. Harvests feeding cities, cities supporting armies, armies protecting trade, trade sustaining the elite maintaining order. When one part failed, the others strained. When several failed at the same time, the entire structure collapsed inward. Modern researchers now believe the collapse happened faster than anyone once imagined, not over centuries, not even over decades, but within a single human lifetime. Children born into a powerful empire died in a world that barely remembered it. Imagine growing up believing your civilization was eternal, that its armies were unbeatable, that its gods protected every stone of every wall, and then year by year, watching food become scarce. Soldiers desert, temples crack, roads grow unsafe, messages stop arriving, until one day, the capital itself falls silent. What do you do then? Some fled. Evidence suggests waves of refugees moved outward, carrying fragments of culture with them, words, techniques, myths. These fragments would later resurface in distant lands, stripped of context, transformed into legend. Others stayed and vanished. Entire regions appear to have been depopulated, not conquered, not assimilated, simply emptied. Forests reclaimed farmland. Rivers flooded abandoned canals. Nature erased the fingerprints of human ambition with slow, patient certainty. The world forgot. For a very long time. It would take thousands of years before scholars even suspected the true scale of what had been lost. Early historians underestimated the empire, seeing it as one kingdom among many. Only when ruins were compared across vast distances did the pattern emerge. This was not a local power. This was a system that once connected half the known world. A superpower in every sense of the word. And its disappearance reshaped history in ways few people realize. Trade routes that once carried ideas and inventions fell silent. Technologies were lost and reinvented centuries later. Political systems regressed. Warfare became smaller, more chaotic, less organized. Knowledge once centralized fractured into regional traditions. In some places, people would later claim that civilization itself had ended. What followed was not darkness everywhere, but it was instability. A long age of uncertainty where memory of the past became unreliable, distorted, mythical. And yet, the collapse also taught something vital. It revealed that power does not vanish only through conquest. It can disappear through exhaustion, through environmental stress, through loss of trust, through the slow accumulation of small failures that, when aligned, become unstoppable. The empire did not fall because it was weak. It fell because it was fragile in ways it did not understand. This is perhaps the most haunting lesson of all. The greater the system, the more catastrophic its failure. The ancient superpower believed it had mastered the world. But the world changed. The climate shifted. The ground shook. Disease spread. Human loyalty fractured. And the empire had no answer for all of it happening at once. So it vanished. Not in a single night, but so fast that, in historical terms, it might as well have. Today, when we stand among its ruins, we are tempted to romanticize them, to admire the stones, the scale, the ambition. But beneath that admiration lies a warning carved into the earth itself. No civilization is permanent. No system is immune. And even the greatest superpower can disappear so completely that future generations will debate whether it ever existed at all. All it takes is one moment when everything fails together, and history moves on without looking back. Time did not preserve this empire kindly. It buried it. As centuries passed, the land healed over the wounds left by collapse. Roads cracked and vanished beneath soil. Canals filled with silt. Once great harbors receded as coastlines shifted. The physical evidence of power dissolved into landscape, leaving only scattered anomalies. Stones too large, walls too precise, foundations too vast for societies that came afterward. People adapted without understanding. They built smaller. They traveled shorter distances. They relied on local traditions instead of centralized authority. The world became quieter, slower, and far more uncertain. Where imperial administrators once tracked grain shipments and tax flows, village elders now judge disputes by memory and custom. And yet, the shadow of the lost superpower never truly faded. Its absence shaped every civilization that followed. Without the empire's protection, borderlands became dangerous. Without its roads, trade fractured. Without its standardized systems, laws varied wildly from region to region. Knowledge became regional instead of universal. Writing survived in fragments, then disappeared entirely in some places, only to reemerge centuries later in new forms. This was not progress or decline. It was reset, a hard reminder that history is not a straight line forward. Archaeologists now know that many later kingdoms rose precisely where the empire once stood, not because they inherited its strength, but because they scavenged its remains. Stones from imperial temples became foundations for new palaces. Bronze was melted down and reforged. Old walls were patched instead of rebuilt. The past became raw material, and the memory of the empire became myth. In some traditions, it was remembered as a golden age when gods walked among humans. In others, it became a cautionary tale of arrogance punished by divine wrath. In still others, it vanished entirely, replaced by stories of chaos before the present order. But myths do not form without reason. Hidden within them are distorted truths. Flood legends echo real climate disasters. Tales of angry gods mirror earthquakes and plagues. Stories of sudden darkness reflect societal collapse. So severe it felt like the end of the world. The ancient superpower did not simply disappear from maps. It disappeared from understanding. Even its enemies struggled to explain what happened. They benefited from the collapse. Yes, they took territory. They seized resources. But they did not replace the system that had fallen. They were not prepared to rule what had once been unified. Power had outgrown the people who survived it. And so, the world fragmented. This fragmentation would define the next era of history. Smaller kingdoms, shorter horizons, limited ambition, survival over expansion, tradition over innovation. It would take centuries before large-scale empires dared to rise again, and even then, they would unknowingly repeat many of the same mistakes. Because the deeper lesson of the vanished superpower was not recorded, no surviving text warned future rulers about dependency on fragile systems. No inscription explained how climate, disease, economy, and belief could collapse together. The knowledge died with those who lived it. All that remained were ruins and silence. Until, much later, humans learned how to listen. Modern science has allowed us to reconstruct the empire's final years not through stories, but through evidence. Tree rings revealing drought. Ice cores recording atmospheric changes, sediment layers marking floods, bones showing malnutrition, burn layers indicating widespread destruction. Piece by piece, the truth emerged. This was not a mystery of a single cause. It was a convergence, a moment in history when the natural world, human society, and political systems collided, and the weakest link gave way first, pulling the rest down with it. And perhaps the most unsettling realization is this. The people living through it did not know they were witnessing the end. They did not call it collapse. They called it a bad year, then a worse one, then an emergency, then survival. Only later did it become clear that the world they knew was already gone. Empires do not announce their endings. They simply stop working. And when they do, the fall can be so complete that the future will struggle to believe the past was ever real. That is a legacy of the ancient superpower that vanished overnight. Not just a lost civilization, but a warning written in stone, buried in earth, and waiting for those willing to remember. Even after the empire was gone, its influence lingered like a ghost that refused to fade. Long after its cities had emptied and its palaces had crumbled, the patterns it set continued to shape the world. Borders drawn in its era influenced later kingdoms. Trade paths that carved through mountains and deserts became the routes future merchants followed, even when they no longer knew who first mapped them. Religious ideas, stripped of their original meanings, survive in altered forms, woven into new belief systems. Civilizations that came later often believed they were inventing these things anew. They were not. They were inheriting fragments of something they could no longer fully comprehend. In some regions, archaeologists have found evidence of people living directly atop imperial ruins for generations without realizing it. Homes built inside collapsed administrative buildings. Animal pens established in former courtyards of kings. Children playing where councils once decided the fate of nations. To them, the stones were simply part of the landscape. The idea that an entire world once functioned from that place had vanished. This raises a troubling thought. If such a powerful civilization could be forgotten so completely, what does that say about memory itself? History depends on continuity, on writing, on institutions that survive upheaval. When those disappear, memory collapses faster than buildings ever could. Within a few generations, even first-hand experiences become stories. Stories become legends. Legends become myths. And myths eventually dissolve into silence. The ancient superpower did not just lose power, it lost narrative control. No one remained to tell its story. Its scribes were gone. Its archives burned or buried. Its language fell out of use. Its symbols became decorative patterns with no known meaning. The empire became unknowable. And in being unknowable, it became vulnerable to misinterpretation. Some later rulers claimed descent from it to legitimize their own authority. Others demonized as a corrupt regime destroyed by fate. Scholars debated whether it was benevolent or brutal, enlightened or oppressive. The truth, as always, was more complex. This superpower was capable of extraordinary organization and immense violence. It built infrastructure that sustained millions and waged wars that devastated entire regions. It preserved knowledge and controlled it. It created stability and enforced it with fear. Its disappearance did not mean the world became better. It meant the world became uncertain. For ordinary people, the collapse was not a philosophical lesson. It was hunger, insecurity, displacement, loss of protection, the end of predictable seasons and reliable authority. Banditry replaced law. Fortifications replaced open roads. Trust became local, fragile, and rare. The empire's fall reshaped daily life in ways no chronicle could fully capture. Generations lived and died without knowing why the world had changed. Only much later would scholars recognize that this moment marked a turning point in human history, a line separating one age from another, a reminder that complexity can be both humanity's greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability. And here lies the final irony. The empire collapsed partly because it was too interconnected, too dependent on systems that spanned vast distances. When disruption occurred in one region, the effects cascaded across the entire structure. In many ways, its world resembled our own, which is why the story of this vanished superpower continues to resonate today. Not because it is ancient, but because it is familiar. We see in its ruins a mirror of ourselves. Our reliance on networks, our faith in stability, our assumption that tomorrow will function like today. The people of that empire believed the same, until it didn't. And when the systems they trusted failed, there was no pause button, no rebuilding plan, no return to normal. There was only adaptation, or disappearance. The ancient superpower that vanished overnight did not leave us a manual for survival, but it left us something else. A question: if it could happen to them, why not to us? The question lingers because it has no comfortable answer. History prefers stories with clear villains and clear endings. A conquering army, a decisive battle, a single date we can circle and say, this is when it ended. But the disappearance of this ancient superpower refuses to fit that shape. It resists simplification. It reminds us that the most devastating collapses are often the least dramatic in the moment. No trumpet sounded to announce the end of an age. Life simply became harder, then smaller, then quieter. In the final years, people likely still woke up expecting the empire to recover. They had seen crises before. Droughts had ended. Revolts had been crushed. Enemies had been defeated. The belief in continuity was deeply ingrained. Empires, after all, were supposed to endure. So when grain shipments failed, they waited for the next convoy. When soldiers deserted, they assumed new recruits would arrive. When temples cracked, they blamed human error, not divine abandonment. Hope persisted longer than the system deserved. But hope cannot repair broken networks. Eventually, the signs became impossible to ignore. Markets stopped functioning. Coinage lost value. Long-distance merchants disappeared. Local leaders stopped obeying distant commands. Borders became meaningless lines on maps no one updated anymore. The empire did not fall forward. It collapsed inward. Power retreated from the edges first, then from secondary cities. Finally, from the heart itself. The capital, once the center of the world, became just another city struggling to survive. And then, one day, it wasn't even that. Excavations show layers where occupation simply ends. No evidence of renewal, no rebuilding, just a final horizon of rubble and dust. After that, nothing. Centuries pass in silence. This sudden absence forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Collapse does not always look like chaos. Sometimes it looks like abandonment, like people leaving quietly in the night, like skill forgotten because no one needs them anymore, like traditions ending because there is no one left to pass them on. The end of the empire was not one moment. It was the last moment anyone remembered how to keep it alive. And that moment passed unnoticed. In later centuries, new powers rose, unaware that they were walking through the aftermath of a forgotten apocalypse. They named the land differently. They spoke new languages. They worshipped new gods. But they inherited a world already shaped by absence. Their ambitions were smaller, their reach shorter, their expectations lower. The ceiling of possibility had dropped. What was once normal, long-distance trade, standardized law, large-scale coordination, became exceptional again. Humanity did not lose intelligence. It lost infrastructure. And without infrastructure, even the smartest societies struggled to maintain complexity. This is why the collapse matters. Not because it was ancient, not because it was dramatic, but because it demonstrates how fragile progress truly is. Civilization is not a permanent achievement. It is a process that must be maintained every day. When enough pressure builds, environmental, social, political, that process can reverse with shocking speed. The people of the vanished superpower were not fools. They were not doomed by ignorance. They were overwhelmed by convergence. Too many failures. Too little time. And when the final thread snapped, the tapestry unraveled completely. Today, the ruins remain scattered across the landscape, silent witnesses to a world that once believed itself eternal. They do not tell us what to build. They do not tell us how to rule. They tell us something far more important, that no matter how powerful a civilization becomes, it is only ever one crisis away from transformation or erasure. The ancient superpower did not vanish because history turned against it. It vanished because history moved on, and it will do so again. Long after the last stone fell and the final road disappeared beneath soil, the world adjusted to the absence without ever truly understanding it. Generations grew up with no memory of imperial order. To them, fragmented authority was normal. Unstable borders were expected. Local conflict was simply part of life. They did not mourn the empire because they had never known it. The idea that one power had once unified such vast lands felt impossible, almost absurd. And that disbelief is perhaps the empire's most complete defeat. When a civilization vanishes so thoroughly that later societies cannot even imagine its existence, it has not merely fallen. It has been erased from collective reality. Yet the earth never forgets. Every excavation, every shard of pottery, every collapsed wall uncovered centuries later reasserts the same truth. Something enormous once stood here. Something capable of shaping entire regions. Something organized enough to coordinate millions of lives. And something fragile enough to disappear. Modern scholars now understand that the collapse of this ancient superpower was not unique. Similar patterns appear throughout history, repeating like a warning that humanity rarely heeds. Complex systems grow. They optimize. They expand. They depend on stability. And when instability arrives faster than adaptation, the system breaks. What made this collapse extraordinary was not that it happened, but how complete it was. Other empires fell and left heirs. This one left a void. There was no successor state powerful enough to claim its legacy, no dynasty to preserve its memory, no continuous tradition to bridge the gap between what was and what came after. The line was cut. This severing of continuity explains why the collapse feels sudden even today. Without written records, without living memory, the transition collapses into a single moment. To us, it appears as if the empire existed, and then did not, overnight. But beneath that illusion lies a deeper reality. Collapse is not an event. It is a process that becomes invisible when memory fails. The people who lived through it experienced confusion, fear, adaptation, and loss. They made choices that made sense in the moment. They tried to survive. They did not know they were participating in the end of an age. No one ever does. That is why the story matters now, not as a tale of ancient ruins, but as a reflection of human behavior, of how societies respond to stress, of how power masked vulnerability, of how confidence delays preparation. The vanished superpower teaches us that resilience is not just strength, it is flexibility, the ability to change before change is forced upon you, the willingness to question assumptions before they become fatal. This empire had mastered the world as it was. It could not adapt to the world as it became. And so it slipped into the past, leaving behind only echoes. Echoes in the land, echoes in myth, echoes in unanswered questions carved into stone and buried by time. When we uncover its remains today, we are not just studying history. We are studying a message, one written without words. A message that says, power fades, memory fails, and civilizations do not end with explosions, but with forgetting. The ancient superpower did not vanish in a single night, but history remembers it that way, because by the time anyone realized what was happening, it was already gone. Even now, standing at the edge of what once was, we are tempted to believe that we would have done better, that we would have seen the signs earlier, that we would have changed course, that we would not have allowed everything to fail at once. But that confidence is an illusion born of hindsight. The people of the ancient superpower were no different from us. They debated policy. They argued about priorities. They trusted experts. They believed the worst outcomes were unlikely because they always had been before. Crisis had become familiar, manageable, survivable, until it wasn't. What truly doomed the empire was not disaster, but delay. Each problem on its own seemed temporary. Droughts had ended before. Earthquakes had been repaired. Rebellions had been crushed. Disease had passed. Every warning sign was explainable in isolation. Together, they were fatal. By the time leaders understood the scale of the threat, their tools no longer worked. Authority meant nothing without resources. Orders meant nothing without loyal forces to carry them out. Laws meant nothing without institutions to enforce them. Power became symbolic, and symbols cannot hold a civilization together. As central control faded, people turned inward. Families relied on kin. Villages relied on walls. Regions relied on strongmen. Survival replaced ambition. The future shrank to the next harvest, the next season, the next safe day. In this environment, knowledge itself became a luxury. Why maintain archives when parchment could be traded for food? Why educate scribes when labor was needed in the fields? Why preserve distant history when the present was uncertain? Information narrowed, horizons shortened. The empire's greatest achievements, its record-keeping, its coordination, its long memory, became irrelevant almost overnight. And once lost, they cannot be easily rebuilt. This is how civilizations truly die. Not when cities burn, but when skills are no longer passed on. Not when rulers fall, but when systems are forgotten. Not when enemies invade, but when continuity breaks. The ancient superpower crossed that threshold silently. Afterward, centuries passed before humanity reached the same level of complexity again. When later empires rose, they believed they were unprecedented. They did not realize they were reclaiming ground already lost long ago. And even then, they built differently, more cautiously, more defensively, with myths of past destruction shaping their fears. The vanished empire became a shadow against which future civilizations measured themselves, even if they did not know its name. Today, We reconstruct its story through fragments, through carbon-dated timbers, through cracked tablets, through ruins aligned with stars that no longer guide us. Each discovery adds detail, but never the full picture. Some questions will remain unanswered. What did the last emperor think as authorities slipped away? Did anyone try to warn the future? Did they know they were living at the end of something irreplaceable? We will never know, and perhaps that is fitting, because the final lesson of the ancient superpower is not about them. It is about us. Their collapse reminds us that stability is temporary, complexity is fragile, and continuity is precious. That the difference between a golden age and a forgotten ruin is often only a few decades of compounded failure. Civilizations do not fall because people stop caring. They fall because caring is not enough. The ancient superpower vanished not in darkness, but in daylight, while people were awake, while life continued, while the future still seemed negotiable. And by the time history realized what had been lost, there was no one left to remember it, only the earth, and the warning it still holds, waiting patiently beneath our feet. Silence followed, not the sudden silence of destruction, but the long, stretching quiet that comes after meaning has drained from a place. Winds moved through empty streets. Rain fell on roofs no one repaired. Grass pushed through stone joints once polished by thousands of footsteps. Animals nested where officials once argued over laws and taxes. The land did what it always does when human order collapses. It reclaimed itself. For centuries, nothing disturbed this quiet. Empires rose elsewhere, unaware that beneath their ambitions lay the remains of something greater than they could imagine. Travelers passed over buried roads without knowing they were walking on the arteries of a forgotten world. Rivers flowed through collapsed ports, carrying no memory of the ships they once hosted. Time succeeded where enemies failed. It erased context. When the ruins were finally rediscovered, they did not announce themselves as imperial. They appeared as anomalies, too large, too deliberate, too advanced for their supposed age. Scholars argued. Some denied what was in front of them. Others tried to force the evidence into familiar narratives of slow decline and orderly transition. But the ground told a different story. Burned layers with no rebuilding. Settlements ending abruptly. Craft traditions disappearing without replacement. Population collapse visible in the absence of everyday objects. This was not transformation. This was termination. And it forces us to confront a deeply unsettling idea, that history contains gaps so vast that an entire world can vanish between the pages. We like to believe we stand on the shoulders of everything that came before. That knowledge accumulates. That progress is permanent. But the vanished superpower exposes that belief is fragile. Knowledge can be lost. Systems can be forgotten. Continuity can break completely. And when it does, recovery takes longer than collapse ever did. The people who lived after the empire were not lesser humans. They were survivors of a world that had become smaller and harsher. They adapted with what they had. But adaptation is not the same as preservation. Something essential was gone. The ability to coordinate at scale. The confidence to build for centuries. The expectation of stability. These are not automatic human traits. They are products of functioning systems. Without them, humanity contracts. And that contraction left scars that lasted for generations. Only much later, when scholars began to piece together the empire's existence, did the true weight of its loss become clear, not as nostalgia, but as perspective, a realization that humanity had once reached heights it struggled to regain, and that those heights were not guaranteed. The ancient superpower that vanished overnight did not just disappear from history. It disappeared from possibility. For a time, the world forgot what was achievable, and that may be the greatest tragedy of all, because collapse does not only destroy what exists, it limits what future generations dare to imagine. The ruins remain not as monuments, but as evidence that even the most advanced societies can fall into silence, evidence that complexity must be defended, not assumed, evidence that forgetting is a final stage of collapse. And somewhere beneath layers of earth and centuries of silence, the vanished superpower rests, not waiting to return, but waiting to be understood, not as a mystery, but as a warning. Understanding, however, is never complete. No matter how many ruins are uncovered or how many fragments are analyzed, there will always be a distance between us and the people who lived through the end. We can measure their walls. We can date their fires. We can chart their climate and reconstruct their diets. But we cannot feel what they felt as the world they trusted quietly unraveled around them. And that distance matters, because collapse is not experienced as history. It is experienced as confusion. In the final years of the ancient superpower, daily life likely continued in familiar rhythms even as the foundations weakened. Farmers planted because planting was what they had always done. Merchants opened shops hoping trade would return. Officials issued decrees, even when fewer people listened. Parents raised children believing that stability somehow would come back. Human beings are remarkably good at normalizing decline. That is why collapse is rarely dramatic from the inside. From within the empire, the end may have felt like a series of unfortunate years rather than the end of civilization. Each loss was absorbed, each compromise accepted, each reduction justified, until, eventually, nothing remained to compromise with. The system had thinned itself to death. This is why no final alarm was sounded. No universal realization occurred. There was no moment when everyone agreed that the empire was finished. People left at different times, adapted in different ways. Some clung to the old order long after it had stopped functioning. Others abandoned it early, sensing instability before it became obvious. By the time certainty arrived, there was nothing left to save. The empire did not fall in unison. It dissolved, and dissolution leaves no monument. What remains instead are questions that echo across centuries. Could it have been prevented? Was there a moment when a different decision might have changed everything? Or was a collapse inevitable once complexity passed a certain threshold? These questions have no final answers, but the pattern repeats often enough to suggest something universal. Civilizations do not fail because they are ignorant of risk. They fail because responding to risk requires sacrifice. Sacrifice of comfort. Sacrifice of growth. Sacrifice of assumptions about permanence. The ancient superpower had grown too accustomed to stability to imagine contraction. Its systems were designed to expand, not to retreat. When the world demanded flexibility, it offered rigidity, and rigidity breaks. What followed was not just the end of an empire, but the end of an idea. The idea that order, once achieved, sustains itself. It does not. Order must be renewed constantly, maintained deliberately, questioned honestly. When it is not, it becomes brittle. When pressure comes, it shatters rather than bends. The vanished superpower learned this lesson too late, and in learning it, it disappeared. Today, we stand far enough away to see the shape of what happened, but close enough to recognize ourselves in it. Our cities are larger, our systems faster, our reach global, but the underlying truth remains unchanged. Complexity multiplies both power and vulnerability. The empire's ruins remind us that collapse does not require malice, invasion, or catastrophe alone. It requires only a moment when adaptation fails to keep pace with change. That moment arrived for them, quietly, incrementally, irreversibly, and when it passed, history did not pause to acknowledge it. It simply continued. Without them, the ancient superpower did not vanish in a blaze of glory. It faded into the background of human memory. And that fading, more than any destruction, is what makes its disappearance complete. Because when memory ends, history ends with it, and the world moves on, unaware of what it has lost. What remains now is perspective. From far enough away, the vanished superpower becomes more than a single civilization. It becomes a pattern etched into human history, repeating itself under different names, in different places, across different eras. The details change, but the structure stays the same. Expansion, complexity, confidence, strain, collapse, forgetting. This empire's disappearance feels especially sudden because it crossed a threshold where recovery was no longer possible. Not because people stopped trying, but because the conditions that made repair possible were gone. Too few specialists, too little coordination, too much fragmentation. Recovery requires memory, and memory had been broken. Once that happens, rebuilding becomes reinvention. Later societies did not restore the empire. They created something new, smaller, and constrained by the lessons they did not know they had learned. In this way, collapse reshapes the future as much as it erases the past. The ancient superpower did not only lose its cities, it lost its ability to define what was normal. For centuries afterward, humanity accepted limits that once would have seemed temporary or unacceptable. Ambition was restrained by fear. Innovation slowed by caution. Scale itself became suspect. The ruins stood as silent proof that greatness could end badly. And so, people aimed lower, not because they lacked vision, but because they lacked trust in systems, in stability, in the future itself. The psychological impact of collapse is rarely discussed, yet it may be its most enduring consequence. When a civilization falls completely, it narrows the imagination of those who come after. The world becomes something to endure rather than to transform. Only when enough time passes does confidence return. And when it does, history begins to repeat. This is why the story of the vanished superpower refuses to remain buried. Each generation rediscovers it and asks the same questions, hoping for different answers. How did they let it happen? Why didn't they stop it? What would we do differently? But perhaps the better question is not how it ended. It is how long it took for anyone to notice. Because collapse is not a cliff. It is a slope. And once you are sliding, stopping becomes harder with every step. The people of the ancient superpower did not fall because they ignored reality. They fell because reality changed faster than their systems could respond. Their institutions were built for a world that no longer existed. When that world disappeared, the institutions followed. This is a quiet truth buried beneath the ruins. Civilizations are not destroyed by single moments. They are undone by mismatches between expectations and conditions, between structure and environment, between belief and reality. When those mismatches grow too large, collapse is not dramatic. It is inevitable. The ancient superpower vanished overnight only in memory. In reality, it slipped away piece by piece, unnoticed by those who needed it most. And by the time history caught up, there was nothing left to record but absence, an absence that still speaks, not with words, but with the weight of everything that is no longer there. And yet, even in absence, the empire's story persists. It survives in the patterns left behind. The roads that still trace the contours of ancient trade networks, the foundations of temples that hint at architectural mastery, the artifacts buried beneath centuries of soil that whisper of lives once lived. Every shard of pottery, every collapsed wall, every carbonized grain tells a fragment of a story too vast to be fully reconstructed. And it is in these fragments that the enormity of the loss becomes clear, not as statistics or dates, but as lived experience frozen in time. For those who come after, there is a dual lesson. One is a warning that even the mightiest systems are fragile, and that unchecked complexity carries hidden vulnerabilities. The other is inspiration, that human ingenuity, organization, and creativity can reach heights so extraordinary that they echo across millennia, even after the civilization that created them has disappeared. But there is a melancholy to this inspiration. It is tempered by the knowledge that greatness can be so thoroughly erased that memory itself falters. To reconstruct the empire is to reconstruct a civilization from whispers. Its story is incomplete, fragmented, and perpetually haunted by questions we may never answer. Who were the individuals who held it together until the last possible moment? What did they fear? What did they hope? What conversations, decisions, and compromises determined the pace of its unraveling? Modern scholars, standing on the shoulders of archaeology, climatology, and forensic study, can provide explanations. They can chart climate shifts, disease outbreaks, political fragmentation, and economic collapse. They can model the chain reactions that made survival impossible. Yet the human experience, the fear, the confusion, the small acts of courage and despair, remains inaccessible. And perhaps that is the ultimate lesson of the vanished superpower. History is not merely the record of triumphs and disasters, but also the memory of absence. Its greatest legacy is that it teaches us humility in the face of our own systems, our own assumptions of permanence. Even as we build, innovate, and expand, we inherit a warning written in stone. buried in soil, and preserved only in the echoes of what once was. The empire vanished overnight, yes, but it continues to speak, not as a narrative with tidy resolutions, but as a living question for every civilization that follows. How long can society sustain itself when the forces it depends on are no longer reliable? How resilient are we, truly, when confronted with cascading crises? And what, ultimately, will be remembered when we are gone? In listening to these echoes, we begin to understand that the story of the vanished superpower is not merely about the past. It is about the fragile, fleeting, and precious nature of human achievement itself. It is about the imperative to preserve, adapt, and question before the next collapse, quiet or otherwise, arrives. And in that understanding, the empire, though vanished, endures, not as a state, a ruler, or a city, but as a lesson written across the canvas of history, waiting for those willing to see, to learn, and to remember. As the centuries unfolded, the memory of the empire became layered, half myth, half evidence, and entirely instructive. Legends grew where history could not reach. Stories told a golden age when men and gods walked side by side, when cities gleamed with impossible wealth, and when armies moved with supernatural precision. Other tales spoke of hubris punished, of a civilization that dared to overstep its bounds and was struck down by forces beyond its comprehension. These myths, distorted yet persistent, were humanity's way of grappling with absence, of trying to give shape and meaning to a collapse so total it defied ordinary understanding. Yet, even in myth, fragments of truth remained. Archaeologists would later uncover streets, temples, and marketplaces that aligned perfectly with these stories, revealing that imagination had preserved memory more faithfully than time itself. And through these rediscoveries, the vanished superpower slowly began to speak again, not in proclamations or decrees, but through evidence etched into the earth. The empire's disappearance also forced neighboring civilizations to adapt. Where once a single power had maintained order, smaller states now contended with uncertainty, filling vacuums that had been left open. Trade became regional rather than global. Military campaigns became limited in scale. Governance relied on local consensus instead of centralized command. In effect, the collapse reshaped human expectations about scale, stability, and possibility. For modern observers, the vanished empire offers a mirror. Its fate illuminates the same vulnerabilities present in any complex system: reliance on fragile networks, dependence on predictable resources, and the assumption that yesterday's stability guarantees tomorrow's security. What the superpower lost in days, or, in historical terms, a single generation, is a cautionary tale for all who assume that size, strength, or wealth ensures continuity. And yet, there is resilience in human memory. Pieces of the empire persisted in subtle ways, through engineering techniques, artistic styles, and religious rituals that survived in altered forms. Knowledge, once localized, seeded future generations, allowing humanity to rebuild, innovate, and expand again. The vanished superpower was gone, but its influence lingered like an undercurrent, shaping the trajectory of societies that never knew its name. In the end, the story of this vanished civilization is not just about loss. It is about continuity through absence. It is about the power of memory, even when fragmented. It is about understanding the delicate balance between human ambition and the forces that govern survival. The empire may have disappeared overnight, but its lessons endure across the ages. They remind us that civilizations are living systems, fragile and finite, sustained only by constant care, adaptation, and foresight. And as we stand today, building cities, systems, and societies of our own, the echoes of that vanished superpower remain, a warning, a guide, and a testament to the fleeting yet profound nature of human achievement. The story is far from over. The ruins are still whispering, and those who listen carefully may yet learn what it truly means for a superpower to vanish overnight. As we trace the remnants of this vanished superpower, we begin to see that its disappearance was not a singular event, but a cascade, a series of compounding failures that no single person, army, or policy could have prevented. Environmental stress, economic strain, political fragmentation, disease, and social unrest intertwined, creating a perfect storm that eroded resilience from the inside out. Each crisis amplified the next, until the empire's foundations could no longer hold. Yet, Within the story of collapse, there is also a lesson about human tenacity. Even as the empire crumbled, countless individuals adapted, survived, and carried fragments of its knowledge forward. Farmers devised new ways to grow food in deteriorating conditions. Artisans preserved techniques in isolated workshops. Travelers and merchants carried cultural and technological innovations across regions. Though the empire itself vanished, its influence persisted, seeding the foundations of future civilizations. This interplay between loss and continuity underscores a deeper truth. No civilization exists in isolation. Its rise and fall are part of an ongoing chain, where the lessons of the past inform the strategies of the future. The vanished superpower may have disappeared overnight in terms of political authority, but its legacy rippled through time, shaping societies that came centuries later. Modern study of this empire also teaches humility. We can analyze climate data, archaeological layers, and genetic evidence, but we cannot fully reconstruct the lived experience of its people. We can see the patterns that led to collapse, but we cannot inhabit the uncertainty, fear, and hope that define those final years. The human element, the decisions, compromises, and small acts of resilience remains partially inaccessible, a reminder that history is always an interpretation of the traces left behind. And perhaps it is the empire's most enduring message. That power is fragile and progress is provisional. No matter how advanced, how organized, or how dominant, civilizations are vulnerable to shifts that occur faster than their systems can absorb. The vanished superpower reminds us that complexity, while enabling greatness, carries hidden risks that can transform achievement into oblivion if not carefully managed. Its silence, its absence, is both warning and guide. It speaks to the ephemeral nature of human ambition, the importance of adaptability, and the consequences of ignoring the subtle signs of systemic strain. For those who study it, the empire does not merely vanish. It communicates. It teaches that survival is not guaranteed by strength alone, but by the capacity to perceive, respond, and adapt before the foundations crumble. In this light, the vanished superpower is not simply a relic of the past. It is a mirror reflecting the delicate balance upon which all civilizations rest, urging us to consider how our own societies might endure or falter under pressures yet to come. And in listening to its echoes, we are reminded that history's lessons, though buried, are never truly lost. They wait, patient and persistent, for those willing to heed them. As the echoes of the vanished superpower continue to resonate, one of the most striking aspects of its collapse is the sheer speed with which its systems unraveled once tipping points were reached. Administrators who had once managed vast territories found their authority ignored. Armies that had marched with precision disbanded or deserted. Trade networks that spanned continents fractured, leaving once thriving cities isolated and starving. The empire did not fall in a single dramatic moment. It disintegrated piece by piece, its infrastructure failing faster than anyone could respond. This incremental unraveling, however, appeared sudden to the outside world. Neighboring states, previously wary of its might, found themselves standing in lands where governance had ceased, where the symbols of power were empty, and where chaos had yet to solidify into new order. The disappearance created opportunities, but also instability, reshaping political and social landscapes in ways that would persist for centuries. From an archaeological perspective, the evidence is both fascinating and haunting. Burned layers of urban centers, abandoned fortresses, and hastily buried treasures reveal a civilization caught mid-transition, frozen in the act of collapse. Artifacts show sudden cessation of production, tools left in workshops, and food stored but never consumed. These are not signs of conquest or gradual decline. They are snapshots of abrupt societal breakdown, suggesting that life for ordinary citizens ended in confusion and desperation, rather than in heroic battles or dramatic uprisings. Moreover, the empire's collapse illuminates the vulnerability of complexity itself. Its extensive networks, which had once been a source of unparalleled power, became liabilities when environmental and social pressures intensified. Crops failed under changing climate conditions, famine spread, disease followed, and the logistical machinery that had once sustained millions ground to a halt. When multiple stresses intersected, the system's resilience evaporated, demonstrating that no civilization, no matter how advanced, is immune to cascading failures. Yet, even in collapse, the empire left a legacy. Innovations in administration, engineering, art, and culture persist in fragments, carried into new societies by survivors, traders, and migrants. Its ideas, technologies, and styles subtly influence regions far beyond its former borders, ensuring that, while the empire as a political entity vanished, its intellectual and cultural footprint endured. The vanished superpower, then, is both a story of absence and a persistence, a civilization that disappeared politically and socially, yet continues to shape human history through what it left behind. It serves as a sobering reminder that the most powerful societies are not invincible, and that the forces which sustain greatness are the same forces whose disruption can bring it to ruin. Ultimately, the empire's disappearance is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a lesson. It teaches that vigilance, adaptability, and resilience are as crucial as strength, organization, and ambition. And in listening to the quiet whispers of its ruins, we gain insight into the delicate balance upon which all human civilizations rest, and the ever-present possibility that even the mightiest can vanish overnight. And so, as we reflect on the vanished superpower, we come to understand that its story is more than a chronicle of destruction. It is a meditation on impermanence, resilience, and the fragile nature of human achievement. Its cities now silent, once hummed with the rhythm of life. Markets bustling, workshops clattering, temples alive with ritual. Its roads connected people, goods, and ideas across vast distances. Its administration held millions in coordinated unity. And yet, all of it could and did disappear, leaving only traces for us to uncover centuries later. The empire's disappearance reminds us that power is never absolute, and that even the most advanced civilizations are vulnerable to forces they cannot fully control. Environmental shifts, disease, political fractures, and social stress converge to overwhelm systems that had once seemed unshakable. What seemed permanent was, in reality, provisional, contingent, and fragile. Its fall was a testament not to weakness, but to the limits inherent in even the greatest human creations. But within this caution lies inspiration. Despite its collapse, the superpower's innovations, ideas, and culture seeped into subsequent generations, influencing societies long after the empire itself had vanished. It left behind lessons in engineering, governance, art, and strategy. It left behind a memory of ambition, ingenuity, and the capacity of human organization to reach heights few could imagine. Ultimately, the vanished superpower teaches us that history is not merely the record of events, but the story of systems, relationships, and consequences. Civilizations rise and fall not solely through conquest or disaster, but through the delicate interplay of countless factors, all of which must be maintained, understood, and adapted to survive. Its disappearance is both a warning and a guide, a warning that even the mightiest are vulnerable, and a guide showing the importance of foresight, adaptability, and the stewardship of knowledge. Standing among the ruins, we realize that the empire did not vanish because it was weak. It vanished because it was human. Its brilliance, its complexity, and its ambition were real, but so were its vulnerabilities. And in that truth lies the enduring message. Greatness is never guaranteed, survival is never permanent, and every civilization, no matter how powerful, carries within it the seeds of its own disappearance. The empire is gone, but its story endures. Its echoes resonate across time, inviting us to listen, to learn, and to consider the fragility of all we build. In its silence, it speaks louder than any victory or monument ever could. That the passage of history is relentless, that power is transient, and that the legacy of a vanished superpower is not merely what accomplished, but what it teaches those who come after. And in heeding those lessons, perhaps we ensure that our own place in history is remembered, not as a cautionary tale, but as a civilization that understood the precarious balance upon which all human achievement rests. If you found this journey into the rise and sudden fall of an ancient superpower fascinating, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more deep dive history documentaries. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an exploration of lost civilizations, ancient mysteries, and the untold stories that shaped our world. Join our community of history enthusiasts and uncover the secrets of the past, one epic story at a time.